So the next speaker, Bunnie Huang, he's the founder of Bunnie Studios. He was the former lead hardware engineer at Chumby. He has a PhD from MIT in electrical engineering and has contributed to many open source hardware projects. He was one of the earliest makers that came to Shenzhen. So I guess like 5 or 10 years ago, when we heard about makers like in Shenzhen, it was silent. Like it's not like out in front of the public today. Bunnie was the observer of how we came from that stage to today. So we'll hear the stories of the early stage of the maker movement in Shenzhen from Bunnie. Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's good to be here at Maker Faire Shenzhen. It's pretty cool. They've got like a stenographer going on over here. I don't know if you guys noticed that. The last time I gave a talk with a stenographer, it was a deposition at a DMCA trial. So I guess I'll feel right at home. Eric Pan invited me out to sort of talk about, I guess, my experience in innovating in Shenzhen, which was, I don't know what that means what about that? But I decided to title it sort of like an outsider's journey through the Shenzhen ecosystem and sort of some things I've encountered along the way. Button press. Yeah. So Shenzhen is great for making things. I've been working with companies in the area for a decade now. And so some of the things I've made is, for example, like this little robotics platform for education. It's called Kovan, and it powers like this little robot for a competition called Botball United States. Another one I made is called AnyTV. It allows for DMCA-free video overlay in HDMI. It's primarily for sort of B2C, social media and advertising purposes. It's a kind of a hobby product that I end up making out here. Another one that I make in the area is chibitronics. It's a little circuit stickers for education and craft, and I have a collaborator, Ji Chi. I don't know if she's here in the audience, but she's showing it actually, I think, over at the Expo Center, I think in the last couple of days, and it's a lot of fun. Another thing that I make here in the Shenzhen area is an open source laptop. So we designed a laptop from the ground up, and it would be basically impossible to build a product of this complexity without the help from this particular ecosystem and being able to utilize all the talented project managers and resources that are available in this area. And also another thing I recently worked on is this reverse engineered open source platform based upon the MediaTek chipset, the 6260. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. This sort of becomes one of the more interesting stories along this narrative later on. So, when Eric asked me to talk about innovation, I had to sort of sit here and scratch my head about what is innovation exactly. And so I can tell you, I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you what it's not, right? Innovation is not a ribbon-cutting ceremony on a big building full of fancy equipment and no people to use it, right? I've seen this happen over and over again where people build infrastructure, but they don't think about the people who are actually going to be using these new labs and all this new equipment. And so what does smell of information? I can't tell you what innovation is, but I can tell you about innovation the way dao, like what its flavor is like, right? And so innovation happens in the streets. Like when people gathering and talking, it happens with people collaborating on projects in the offices and small companies around the area. It happens in the sample making rooms of companies where people with a lot of tradecraft figure out how to solve difficult problems that computers can't model, that engineers can't figure out in advance, and they go ahead and tweak and they make things better. And it happens on the floors of the factories, of all the hard labor of people putting things together like test jigs and all of the bits and pieces that are required to go to production. Another thing that smells of innovation that I really like around the Shenzhen area is all of these phones that you see coming up, all the Shenzhen phones that appear all over the place. I mean, all the way from the people you see in the corners of the streets in Shenzhen sort of digging phone parts out of garbage piles, all the way to sort of all the panoply of interesting phone objects that you can see cropping up everywhere. And so one question is, where does all this sort of come from at the end of the day? And I like to sort of go through this, this sort of narrative of, okay. That's like, apparently the clicker's not working. We've got a human clicker, so I'm trying to emulate a clicking motion, and she picks up the click and advances the slide. So, no, it's good, it's good. I'm explaining what's going on so we can see. Okay, click. So, Shenzhen is what I like to do at powers of 10. So there's this video made a long time ago called Powers of 10 movie by Charles and Ray Eames, and I don't know if people in China are as familiar with it, but a lot of people from the Western ecosystem would have seen this. It's like this, and unfortunately this little bar here is blocking the key point, but it starts with this picture of a guy, and it zooms out, and you see a picture of a park, and it zooms out, and you see a picture of a city, and then it zooms out, you see the picture of the planets and the Earth, and finally you see the universe, right? And so I like to, talk about sort of Shenzhen sort of zooming in, right? So at the 1x zoom, right, at the very coarsest level, what people know about Shenzhen, particularly from the outside, is that it makes iPhones. And there's a company called Foxconn there, right? That's, people are like, oh, I know Shenzhen. Shenzhen has Foxconn. That's what people say at 1x zoom. Click. The electronics ecosystem here, if you zoom in a little bit and you see what's going on, you see this city area. This is a picture of the Huachan district, where I show this to people who are not familiar with Shenzhen and who are from America, and they're like, oh, this must be a financial district, this looks like a business area, that sort of thing. It's like, no. These aren't banks, right? These are buildings full of people doing electronics and electronics work. And they're like, no way. And you go, click. And you say, here's what a picture is inside of one of these buildings. Like there's hundreds of these buildings, and each of them have floors full of components and bits and pieces that look like this. Click. And in each one of these stalls, you have these amazing variety of components. And one thing I like to point out to people is that you can sort of count the number of tape and reel components, and then count the number of components in these trays. And you can go to DigiKey, which is an American distributor, and look up the stock levels. And these guys have more stock in their booth than DigiKey has in their whole inventory, right? And this is like at 100,000x zoom, you're going to store after store after store, where essentially you can go ahead and get for cash over the counter, like the inventory of DigiKey in your hands, and walk out with it and go and do some production. Click. And then if you walk around in the streets of Shenzhen, you see these scenes of people sort of just like collecting phones and recycling them and taking them apart and putting things back together again. And sort of in the, even inside the fingernails dirt of Shenzhen, there's people dealing with electronics. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts, is that it has gotten so pervasive that it's just a normal thing on the sidewalk to see this occurrence happening. It's not an unusual thing. You just sort of like, oh, there's another one of these guys recycling phones, right? And I think that's indicative of how deeply the ecosystem is rooted in the area. So another view on this is sort of what I call sort of trickle-down view of things. So another way to sort of try to understand how this came about is you look at the evolution over time and the number of people involved. So roll all the way back to 1980, when first Foxconn and Huawei and those guys were digging up ground and bringing tens of millions of assembly laborers out of the billions of people in China to create back to that slide. There you go. I'll tell you when. Yeah, go ahead. And so of those sort of tens of millions of assembly laborers, we could say that perhaps 1% of them will gain a technical ability to go beyond just being an assembly laborer, but being something more like a technician and engineer, someone who can go and read a schematic, debug a circuit, right? So they haven't necessarily gone through college or been formally trained, but they have, they've picked up a trade skill, right? And this is started around 1990s. And then say 1% of those people, of the 100,000 technicians and engineers, you get 1,000 sort of managers and designers, right? 1,000 people who can now step out of the company, right, and go and start their own company because they now understand how to design, how to build their own phones. And you start to see, the rise of the Shenzai, people who are leaving these companies with their trade skills and the knowledge and going ahead and building their own versions of things that you're very familiar with. And then just recently, we're finally getting down to that level where 1% of those guys are finally seeing a big success. And you're starting to see like the phenomenons of Xiaomi and Tencent, Taobao, Alibaba, all these big sort of companies. And now people are like, oh my God, this is amazing innovation that's happening out here. You know, where does it come from? That came and like must have come recently. No, it actually has been like this very long process, basically harnessing this whole population of people and people learning through decades of time the tradecraft that they have to bring us to the point where we are today. And so another view on this is also sort of, you look at sort of the supply chain out here. One of the reasons why the supply chain here is so rich and able to service small makers and people like me is that this sort of scene. Like, I mean, I love this. Like, I'm driving down the road on the highway and I see like a pick and place machine and reflow oven on a truck, right? This like makes me really excited when I see this, and this comes from this idea that, you know, maybe some top of the line high-end company 20 years ago would have bought this equipment for $1 million, and they would be churning out phones with it. Robots kind of don't go bad. You replace their components and stuff, but they still are able to perform the tasks they're designed for. So 3 years later, they've depreciated their equipment. They sell it as scrap for 10% of the original cost, and another guy picks it up for 10 years and churns out, I don't know, DVD players or something, right? And then 10 years later, that guy wants to get a new piece of equipment. He sells that as scrap for $10,000. So this originally $1 million piece of equipment is now traded hands twice, is now available for a very reasonable price for an entrepreneur to use. And it's picked up by a small factory, but had the capability to build those phones, right? And so what you're now finding is there's a lot of excess capacity in these older equipment. You drive through the streets of Dongguan and Guangzhou, you'll see like these shops with like CNCs and reflow ovens and all sorts of stuff sitting outside waiting for people to pick it up and do something with it. And this availability of supply chain and capital equipment out here is one of the things I think that is really empowering about working in this area. So another thing that I think that is extremely empowering about this area is the China's view of intellectual property, IP, right? And so I've been scratching my head on this one for a long time, trying to deeply understand what's going on here. And the best way I can summarize it is that in the West, there's this broadcast view of intellectual property. If you think about it, patents and copyrights are all assigned to an individual, right? This is like Tony Stark of innovation. There's like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and all these guys who you think of. We have these heroes, inevitably, who are broadcasting to the world their good ideas, and society as a whole owes it to them for their good work, right? That's a very Western notion of how IP works. Whereas China is sort of like the master of, in some sense, sort of social networks, because they've had this Guanxi network for a long, long time before we had social networks even. And IP here tends to work more as a network. It gets traded as a commodity between individuals and people who know how to use the IP. And so IP doesn't just come as like a patent, but it's also like the know-how of how to implement that. And the value of that actually comes in terms of knowing that person in the factory, not just the idea of that particular item. Click. And so in the West, there is a style of sort of sharing that's called open source, right? And it's translated here as Kaiyuan. And the key point here is that the IP owner, in this case, there is an owner in all cases, but what they're doing is they're allowing you that freedom. The IP owner has a right to keep it to himself, but he explicitly says you're allowed to trade and share it. That is the key point of open source. And so you have, again, organizations like Linux, run by Linus Torvalds, who has a copyright, who allows you to share Linux, right? And you have Arduino, it's run by an organization, who allows you to do these things, and so on and so on and so forth. Click. It's very legally complex, and it leads to a lot of weird things that happen. So, for example, Arduino is suing Arduino, right? Because you have this broadcast view of IP. There's now like this champion owner of the trademark of Arduino. And you can end up with a situation where, you know, organizations are fighting internally amongst themselves. Or another, for example, is that the open source initiative, which has a logo that looks like this, right, decided to go and hand, I think, a cease and desist to the open source hardware organization because their logos look too similar, right? And it's very legally complex. There's a lot of difficulty that people have, even in a quote-unquote open system. There's a lot of rules you have to abide to that really can be difficult. Click. And also, innovation is extremely subjective. I don't know if you guys have been watching this case here at all, but this is design patent 593087. It was recently valued at $400 million, right? So, and this design patent is, if you know the language of design patents, it's a rounded rectangle. Like that dotted line there means that's not actually part of the patent. What they're claiming is a rounded rectangle, okay? And that's worth $400 million according to the Western IP system, right? It's very discouraging as a small innovator to see these kinds of things happen. You feel like, how is this even possible? There is a centralized system of decision makers who decide what's innovative and what is not. There's the patent office. It's not a very democratic process. No one has a vote about what this is. There's a guy who just sort of makes a decision, and they hear out in court, and then you end up with situations like what we're in right now. And the other problem is that patent and copyright terms are extremely long, especially compared to the pace of IT. 20 years to have a monopoly on something is forever. I mean, if you saw that little chart of the trickle down of innovation, that's like the whole span between like, from Foxconn to like Shanzai, right? It's pretty crazy. So, click. On the other hand, China-style open source, like you can right now go online, search on Baidu, and grab the schematics and the layout, and you can go into the market and buy the components, and you can go ahead and build your own phone, right? And it's not clear who's to credit for all these things that you can get, but you can do that, right? The problem is you just can't do that in the West. And because you can do that out here, you've created this huge ecosystem that can create like this massive variety of phones, which I think is a very interesting idea. And so one of the problems is that in China you can get the source without legal friction, and that the IP finds freedom regardless of legal background. So you really can't call it gongkai, because gongkai, the literal translation of open source, is someone was authorizing you to use their idea explicitly as sharing. And so I came up with my own term, and I don't know if it's the right one, but I call it gongkai, more at public, more like it's there in the public, right? It's there that people can use it, but it's not really so much licensed, right? But at the end of the day, the ideas here find their freedom, right? Regardless of the legal background, and that is a very interesting concept. I think it's a very good concept that we could learn from. Next slide. And so if you look at it, we have different systems made over different times. The Western broadcast worldview is an IP system developed in the age of centralized broadcast, right? So in the age of TVs, radios, movie theaters, right? You discovered content through billboards and newsprint, and you had mega corporations. And this IP system is very appropriate for that model. Whereas China's IP traditions are developing in the age of networks, right? Where, like, it came about in an era where you had the internet, you had downloads, you had the long tail, you have discovery through search, right? And you have startups and upstarts. So this notion of the way the IP flows out here actually came organically, partially enabled by the technology itself today that it's helping to power. Next slide. And so, as I was referring to this project here, this is a project I did where I wanted to learn how to use this ecosystem at a deep level to build my own product, right? So I went online and I downloaded the schematics and the source and designed my own motherboard using a MediaTek GSM phone chipset, right? And I want to see exactly how low friction this ecosystem was. Could I do it myself, or was this just a theoretical exercise? Am I just here spouting hot air? And the good news is, yes, I was able to engineer my own, essentially my own phone. And for a lot of complex legal reasons, it doesn't look like a phone and blah, blah, blah. It has modularity, and I kind of know the legal frameworks on how to sort of edge by this. But at the end of the day, we were able to sort of proof of concept that this is something that you can use. And another thing that I'm really looking into here is, like, how do we now take this unique freedom that exists in China and bring it back to the West, where that freedom does not exist? And so there's another framework that I'm trying to work on of trying to figure out how do I take the sort of this gongkai IP style and then repatriate it into the Western ecosystem through the laws and the rules of laws they have there, by essentially reassigning the copyright to myself on the facts of how to build this, and then allowing the West to use it by explicitly saying that's okay, right? And this is a framework that anyone can use. And once you learn how to use it, I think it will help bridge the two systems a lot more effectively. And so there's actually an article that ran in Gizmodo recently about this, and you can see the comment thread. You can see how much a lot of people don't like what I'm doing in the United States. But on the other hand, I think it's an important question to ask. It's an important idea to explore. Click. And so when I was asked sort of, how do you sort of innovate with Shenzhen? Innovation here, I find, happens in streets and in the humble offices, right? Having less to lose makes it easier for people to take a risk necessary for innovation. And the problem that one of the worries I have is that as sort of money starts pouring directed towards innovation, and the metrics start getting applied, these people start feeling they have a risk, right? Because now they have an obligation to deliver something, and they don't take that risk that they used to take anymore. Right? And that actually almost immediately is the beginning of the end of an innovative ecosystem. Right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that this sort of street smart nature out here is one of the more important things that's happening out here. And another thing that's very important is that this ecosystem is powered by a low friction of IP exchange, ease of trade, and ease of collaboration. I can get stuff done very easily here that I can't do in the United States because I can work with this ecosystem. And to this point, like, the Western characterization of China-style IP as being sort of like, I don't know, thievery or whatever it is about as accurate as saying that Shenzhen is Foxconn and iPhones, which if you ask most Westerners, that's what they say Shenzhen is about. So you need to get in and have this very nuanced view of what's going on here to understand that actually there has been a system, there are traditions, there is rules to the system. It's not the Wild West. And that system is actually working and producing innovative products. And that I think that in order to innovate with Shenzhen, we need to learn how to embrace this phenomenon that's going on and not necessarily fight it or try to supplant it. So that's it. Thanks.